Israel is trouble. It's been a menace for years. Now it's an existential threat. It needs to go away. And that is the view across the Muslim world. And of course, we fall in behind Israel. In other words, we don't want America around because America is responsible for this.
Do both sides fall in behind Israel? Both the Democrats and the Republicans?
Yes, right now, yeah. Well, listen, you can't, I don't think you can oppose Israel in any real sense on the Hill and really survive. So if you hold a seat in Congress, whether it's the House of Representatives or the Senate, you're not somebody, unless you're wildly independently wealthy, and you have a voter base that is impregnable. In other words, you have the staunch support of people in your district or state. You have to bend the knee to Israel, or the Israel lobby will spend money to get rid of you. They'll push you out of office because they'll go and support your alternative because they're a single issue lobby. They don't care what else you do. They just want to be sure that when it's time to give Israel money, when it's time to support Israel, when it's time to back Israel, you will do that. Thomas Massie, he's a Republican from Kentucky.
Yep.
And Thomas Massie gave an interesting interview. If you haven't seen it, I would go look for it, to Tucker Carlson. And it was interesting because he told something that most people didn't understand in the United States. He said every Republican congressman and senator has an Israeli minder. I said, what do you mean? He has a minder. In other words, there's a representative in his office for AIPAC, the American Israeli Political Action Committee. And he's there to advise you what you should or should not vote for.
Interesting.
And if you vote for something that the Israel lobby deems as antithetical to their interests, you have a choice. You can change your vote or they'll turn against you. On the Democrat side, it varies because, first of all, large numbers of Democrats don't have to be persuaded, but you also have a new crop of Democrats that have come in. And this is where race seems to figure rather prominently, that are very, very, very anti-Jewish. So right now, I don't think that's a major problem or threat for the Israel lobby. Now, maybe as this war breaks out and people start taking losses and this thing drags on and harms everybody economically, that may change.
So how do you see it playing out? You got Hezbollah, Houthis, Hamas, you got the Suez Canal being blocked, you got the Red Sea, you got new tactics happening, you got Iran ready to support. You're a military person. What's the strategy?
I think you'll probably see an initial firing of weapons from Hezbollah, and then Iran will probably join in. What I don't know is, what does that mean? In other words,
and the response?
How much are they going to employ against Israel? And I'm sure that there are debates even now. I'm sure they have various plans. And I'm quite certain that some people are saying, look, if we're going to do this, let's not hold back. Because we know that when the Israelis counterstrike, they will not hold back. So why should we exercise restraint? And see, to this point in time, whatever you think about the Iranians, they've exercised considerable restraint because they very honestly don't want a war. So, we'll have to see how this turns out. But I think...
Well, what do they want then?
I think they want to be left alone by the Israelis. And I think they want the Israelis to leave Muslims alone in the region. That means stop killing and expelling people from Gaza. That means cut a deal with Hezbollah, recognize the legitimacy of their position on the other side of the border. That means recognizing that they're going to be a normal state in the region. Hezbollah exists today because of the Israeli occupation of Lebanon. There was no Hezbollah when the Israelis went in there. So I had Israelis sit me down and tell me that when I've been over there several times since 1999. They said, yeah, we're pretty stupid. We created Hezbollah. Then, of course, you realize that Hamas was also a creature of the Israeli government and the Mossad because they thought it could be developed as a useful counter to other groups, particularly the Palestinian Authority. They wanted to divide the Palestinians. Mr. Netanyahu, to some extent, that was his brainchild. All of these things have backfired on them rather badly. So if the answer is we just have to kill more Muslims, which appears to be the solution at this stage, I don't think that's going to work.
But didn't they return Gaza back to Hamas? So,
Well, yes, they returned it nominally to Arabs, but you remember that Gaza was originally under Egyptian administration
yes.
until after the 73 war.
Yep.
And when it came to discussing who would take it back and who would run it and so forth, Anwar Sadat told Begin, forget it. We don't want anything to do with it. But there was a tacit agreement that the Egyptians and the Israelis would cooperate to contain the problem. And indeed, that's what they've done. The Egyptians and the Israelis have worked very carefully together to deal with various forms of Islamic jihadists that emerged inside Gaza and cooperated with other people in the Sinai. In fact, that's one of the casualties, I think, of this particular conflict right now, which is so tragic, that Egypt and Israel had a good modus vivendi. I think that's dead now, and I don't see it being restored. In fact, I'll be very surprised if General Sisi survives in Egypt and we do not have a coup and see a much more radical anti-Israeli, anti-Western government come to power there. I think the same threat is very real in Jordan. King Abdullah is another one that now is regarded widely as an Israeli puppet. I don't think that's fair. I think he and his father both tried to maintain stability and commerce and so forth. But that's the view, and I think he will be gone. I think that Mohammed bin Salman has figured out that he's got to get on the right side of this issue, or he too might be out of a job. I think this is a wave that has sort of washed over the Islamic world. They're taking a position that Israel does. The Israelis take the position you're either with us or against us. I think all of the Islamic states have taken a similar position. Either you're with us or against us.
And if the Israelis in the America, I don't know if the Americans will, but if the Israelis hit Iran, if they decide to do so, do you see potentially a destabilization of the Iranian government, totalitarian and strong, a potential rise by the people?
Do any of the people in Iran have a weapon?
No, but there was an Arab Spring. There was an Arab Spring some time ago. It was supported.
Yeah, but they have no weapons. That's why we have the Second Amendment to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in the United States.
To bear arms, yep.
They have no way of rebelling against anybody. They'll be shot to pieces. It's that simple. I mean, look at the people in England that are rebelling effectively. They're very unhappy, but what can they do about it? They don't have any weapons. And this is true all over Europe. This is the problem that we have with this desire to turn everyone into a sedated consumer who will mindlessly behave the government. Take all their weapons away and they have no choice.
Okay.
That's why we Americans will never do that.
Okay. What's your thoughts on, at the moment, the state of play in Ukraine and Russia and the push by the Ukrainians of late into Russia? I know, I've listened to a lot of your commentary.
This is not much of a push. There's a few thousand, and it looks like this was planned in Great Britain. And we have evidence that there are a number of American, British advisors involved in this. And I think they simply looked at the border with Russia. And remember, the entire border of Russia is not fortified and defended. The war is actually contained. And this is a very large area in Ukraine. Americans have no idea what they're dealing with. I mean, you've got something the size of Texas you're fighting over. We haven't done anything like that for a long time. Even in the European campaigns, we never conducted war on the scale that the Germans and the Soviets did, or the Germans and the Austrians and Russians did during World War I.
And as NATO and the Americans let
there's
down,
an understanding of the dimensions.
Yep.
So what we did is we ran the satellites on passes across the territory, and we saw the areas that were lightly defended. I think in this particular area where they penetrated, there were only 50 policemen initially. And so they said, this is great. We can make a splash. Then somebody decided, well, let's go for the nuclear power plant in Kursk. Because if we can damage the plant and cause an emergency, that will harm Russia. And maybe that'll give us a chance and convince people in the West to continue to support us. It was part PR and part strategic, as it was aimed at the Kursk nuclear power plant. They did damage the cooling system at the power plant, but that's being repaired. and they are being systematically annihilated as you and I are sitting here.
Yeah.
And I'll be
Slaughtered.
interested to see the bodies, which I'm sure will include some Americans and Brits, because we've already lost people there that we never admit to. And I'm sure the Russians will be happy to put them on television. The bad news here for the future is that Putin has now announced, and I can't blame him for it, there will be no negotiations. This is over. And to me, that means that he's going to finish off this regime in Kiev. Now, how he does it and when and where, I don't know, but there's not much to stop him from moving forward. But the issue for him, the dilemma for him and for the Russians has always been, they don't want to rule Ukrainians. The areas that he's currently controlling are full of Russians.
But it's still sovereign land. They're still there. It was still Ukraine before he went in there. It was given back, remember?
Well, let's put it this way.
I know it's been under Russian control many years ago and everything else by history, but it was sovereign to that point,
Crimea
correct?
Was Russian from
Yep.
1776.
Yeah, but it was given back by the USSR.
No, the USSR, you had Khrushchev in a drunken bout at his dacha who decided to reward his communist buddies, who incidentally, the communist buddies that ran Ukraine,
Yep.
they were Russians.
Yep.
They weren't Ukrainians. No Ukrainian nationalist will tell you, oh, we got it back. Bull. That's just nonsense. In fact, we had many Ukrainians in the United States. Jack Palance, a very famous movie star, was Ukrainian,
Yep.
came from Pennsylvania, where I'm from.
Yep.
And he was awarded some medal from the Ukrainian USSR for his brilliant performances. And he basically spat in their faces and said, you are not Ukrainians. I don't know anything about what you are, but you're not Ukrainian. So at that point, I mean, that's sort of like shuffling a town or two on the border with Pennsylvania back and forth to New York when nobody's paying attention. It's irrelevant. What you've got now, and this is an old part of the world where borders have changed repeatedly over many years. Populations have changed.
Yep.
Putin understands that. The populations in eastern Ukraine were Russian. The majority of the population on Crimea was not Ukrainian. And the non-Ukrainians were being treated as second and third class citizens. They were being punished in courts of law. They were at a tremendous disadvantage because they were being subject to Ukrainianization. And the Russians didn't like it. And that was the purpose of the Minsk Accords. Those were drafted with the object of holding Ukraine intact, but addressing these critical issues to satisfy Russian sensibilities. Well, we now know that the Minsk Accords were a fraud because Chancellor Merkel made that very clear. Macron has admitted it was just to buy time to build up a bigger Ukrainian army whose goal was to attack Russia. Hello. I would have done exactly what Putin did. And I would not give up an inch of territory right now that has a Russian living on it to the Ukrainians again. So he doesn't want to go further west if he can avoid it. He really doesn't, because he doesn't want to manage and govern Ukrainians. He wants them to do that for themselves. The problem is, how does he get that done as long as the Zelensky regime is in Kiev? And that's a whole nother question.
So from that perspective, you know, we started on Eisenhower and we talked about NATO. So is this been an absolute complete failure by NATO and the Americans? And why are the Americans still supporting something which is costing lives and an enormous amount of money and capital? If you think at the end of the day, we're wasting our time and Putin's outsmarted all of us.
Oh, absolutely. We're wasting our time. And we have no historic or current or past strategic interest in Eastern Ukraine. Who controls Eastern Ukraine is of no consequence to us whatsoever on a purely strategic level. I think this is an entirely fraudulent war perpetrated by people in Washington, London, and Kiev. And that's a puppet government that we set up. There are lots of people that are behind this, but I think as far as NATO goes, I think NATO is pretty much dead man walking. I think it'll go out of existence. In January, before the invasion commenced, I was interviewed, and you can look it up, by Dmitry Simes, as a Russian who ran the Center for National Interest. And he asked me the same question. I said, if we embark on this, it will be the end of NATO.
Yeah, okay.
But NATO won't end until you see the current governments go away. And you're going to see that happen. I think you're going to see Scholz gone. I think you're going to see Macron go, and I think you're going to see changes in Scandinavia. The real question is what happens in Britain. I don't know that. I can't predict that one. I just don't know. But I know the Germans and the German population is definitively turned against this Ukrainian war thing. I don't think they know the whole story because the press has studiously avoided telling the truth. But enough is coming through now. They have enough Ukrainians on the ground in Germany that they do understand what's happening. So I think Scholz will go away, and the Christian Social Union in Bavaria, which is the sort of Bavarian wing of the Christian Democratic Union, has said, either you get on board and we end this war, or we're leaving the union with you. So I think things are really going to change. France has always been a bellwether for change. You know what Metternich used to say, if they sneeze in Paris, Europe catches a cold. Well, I think Europe's caught the cold.
Do you think Trump will do the deal if he gets in charge?
First of all, I don't know. He's got people around him who don't want to do the deal. He's appointing people who are warmongers, people who are neocons. This was his problem during his first term. He didn't pay attention to who they were. If you go back and look, and he was asked about so-and-so and so-and-so, what about this man as your national security advisor? He's a well-known neocon warmonger. He said, he doesn't matter. He said, why not? Because I make all the decisions. Well, Donald Trump should have learned by now that he was dead wrong. It matters very much who becomes a cabinet officer. We have 5,000 appointed positions in Washington.
Yeah.
You got to fill them all. And you got to fill them with the right people. If you're filling them with people that don't agree with you, that don't support you, that are told to ignore you, which is what happened, then how much can you reasonably accomplish? So I don't know what President Trump has learned about this.
All right. Now, we started on the conversation talking about where the power lies with the US regards to the economy. Now, if we talk about the economy, the global economy, that's world trade. And now we've got the likes of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran creating, in many regards, a very strong relationship. And you've got the US trading with Europe, which is sort of floundering in certain areas. What's your take on the shift and how we've allowed that to happen? Is it good, bad, and China has flexed its muscle and they've played a smart, very tight game?
Well, North Korea has been circling the drain for years economically. It's a basket case. The Russians sort of continued to try and help sustain it as much as they could, but within limitations. And you'll recall that in 2019, that President Trump and I was in touch then with his offices, understood that this was a time to make some hard decisions. And you had a government in South Korea that very much wanted us to leave. By the way, I think most Koreans would still like us to leave, and I think we will. But at the time, there was an opportunity to do it under very favorable circumstances and to get something for it. And behind the scenes, it was very clear that we could get a deal for denuclearization in North Korea if we tied it over a period of, say, 5 years to U.S. withdrawals from North Korea. Now, why is that, or from South Korea? Now, why is that important? Well, if you withdraw from the peninsula of South Korea, there's no requirement for us to be in Japan.
Yeah.
We have ground troops in Japan who are there to reinforce the defense of South Korea. In other words, this leads to the demilitarization of our relationship with Asia, which is desirable. We don't want to go to war with anybody in Asia. Anybody who says that we should be prepared to is insane. It's just abundantly stupid. So no, we don't want to go to war with anybody. There are people in Washington who want to go to war with everybody in sight every other damn day, and they have no idea what the hell a war is. They've never seen it, never will. Or they might, but if they do, it's their own fault. But the point is that North Korea is on the whole really a Russian satellite. And given what's happened now, I think the Russians have decided that North Korea is extraordinarily useful. Because one of the first things that a lot of us warned the administration was, you're focused on what's happening in Ukraine, but the Russians can escalate horizontally. Where do the Russians have good relations? They have good relations in Cuba. Good relations in Venezuela.
Yep.
Good relations in Mexico.
Yep.
So do the Chinese. Mexico has always been hostile to us. They hosted the Germans, then they hosted the Soviets. The largest KGB operation outside of Russia was
Mexico.
in Mexico.
Yep.
We have never had good relations with Mexico, which is why we had the army on the border there from 1846 to 1948.